Hey everyone, welcome back to another edition of Sports Speak on a Friday. I'm Eddie Kalegi.
And I'm Tim Moore.
Lots to get to, busy weekend ahead. We'll recap week 2 in the NFL where it seems like the apocalypse because everybody is injured. Baseball, it's the final weekend. We'll discuss who are real contenders and who are pretenders in the expanded playoffs. Can the Miami Heat close it out tonight? Will the Nuggets come back from another 3-1 deficit? And what about NASCAR? Michael Jordan is a team owner. We'll get into all that, but let's begin things with a little week 2 recap. And the story was certainly injuries. There were a lot, and they weren't just your typical bumps and bruises. The number of torn ACLs. I mean, Saquon, Bosa, those were probably the two biggest names that are gone for the year. Broncos lost Drew Lock for a period of time. The 49ers got absolutely decimated on the MetLife Stadium turf and now have to play there again on Sunday with now Nick Mullins as their quarterback because Jimmy G is out. Colts lost 3 of their 4 secondary players, including Malik Hooker, for the season. I mean, I think this is proving, as much as we don't like preseason sometimes and we think it's dragged on a little too long, these guys need at least one game of, warming up because now we're seeing so many injuries these first 2 weeks.
Yeah, we've seen so many injuries, and to me, it's just so scary, Eddie, when I think about it, because I know usually when you have the preseason, for the record, it's not atypical, to say the least, of having a superstar sit out of the preseason. But what scares me, the fact is that you would think with this extra rest time going through training camp, you would expect to have more healthier players. But just like baseball, for example, that what we've seen to open up the year in short, we shouldn't say short because really football had their full practice protocol and such. But in terms of short turnover, they've had so many injuries. And it makes me worry of the team because, for baseball, when we started the year, for example, it was, okay, whoever's going to win the World Series this year, they're going to probably win because they're the team that survived COVID. Turns out now in baseball, it's really the teams that survive injury in the first 60 games that are looking their ways to go to the playoffs. We may see the same thing right now in the NFL, and I know injuries are apparent, but I can't recall a season opening up in a very long time that has had so many superstars and impact players in particular hurt in the first 2 weeks. But a lot of it has to do, too, and I know this sounds very interesting, and I'm not going to talk about this as my ass when it comes to my turn, but one thing in particular that I've noticed these first 2 weeks, obviously we know a lot of missed field goals. That's expected because they haven't really had much, time on the field. But how about the penalties? The penalties have been down to 2 bunch. I'm not saying that's a contributing factor, but the game doesn't just change in a year. So I wonder if that has a little bit to do with it. In fact, that some missed penalties, could impacting, hurting a player and all this such, and that there's almost like a blind eye to it to open up the year.
I think that could definitely be in consideration, but let's get into our SEC week recaps. So I'm going to start with my S. Well, it's not a surprise that Steve Cohen bought the Mets. My surprise is that Sandy Alderson is going to be back in the organization, and I mean, he's the president of operations. He's basically going to replace Brody. Brody's going to be gone on Sunday. So, it's a bit of a surprise to me because and there are a lot of Mets fans who have mixed feelings about this. There are the ones who are just, so hyped up. Steve Cohen's going to make the Mets equivalent to the Yankees in spending. And then when you bring in Sandy Alderson, who was a Wilpon guy, I mean, what's the logistics there? But think about some of the trades that Sandy Alderson was able to accomplish. The 2 big ones, traded R.A. Dickey at 39 years old to get Noah Syndergaard and Travis d'Arnaud. And then getting Cespedes to help fuel them to the World Series in 2015. I know the contract afterwards hasn't really worked out the way the Mets hoped, but think about what you can get from that. And they went to the World Series and almost won. So, I mean, that was a good move by Alderson. And the people who are like, oh, we brought in Jason Vargas and Jay Bruce. Well, that's not all just on him either. He also had this tight budget that he had to work with because of the Wilpons. Now you have Steve Cohen's money. You have more flexibility. I know he did the Moneyball thing with Oakland before he was with the Mets, but guess what? Now he's going to have the money and the resources, and we know he's good at negotiating trades, and I think he's good at negotiating players, and at least it's someone who's actually worked in the front office before and not an agent like Brodie Van Wagenen, but I'm kind of surprised by this move. My expectation, is that the Lakers have come out strong and they're up 3-1 against Denver. I know 3-1, the Denver Nuggets have come back twice. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but the Lakers have looked really solid. Of course, Anthony Davis hitting that buzzer beater in game 2 from long range. I mean, the Lakers are really locked in, and it's really looking like we might see Lakers and Miami playing for the finals, which might not have been what people thought going into the bubble, but you know what? I think we expected either the Lakers or Clippers were going to be there regardless. And my conclusion is that I'm trying to phrase this properly, that in NASCAR, I think we're going to start to see more of these, situations where current drivers or recently retired drivers start getting more ownership stakes. We'll talk about this more later too, but Denny Hamlin is co-owning this team with Michael Jordan to field Bubba Wallace. We know Jeff Gordon, has such a large say at Hendrick Motorsports. Of course, Stewart-Haas Racing. Tony Stewart was driving back when he helped started that team with Gene Haas. I think we're going to see more of that as some of these drivers, they don't want to just be known as drivers. You think about superstars in other sports, they want to be known for their brand. And Denny Hamlin's not the only one. I know Denny Hamlin's got connections with Jordan and all that, but I think there's people like Kyle Busch or maybe even a Kevin Harvick who we might see step up in that way in the future, and maybe while they're driving, get an ownership thing. I know Kyle Busch owns his truck team, but maybe expand that even further. But that's my SEC. Tim, over to you.
Well, if you really do think about it, Kyle Busch obviously with KBM, and he did expand KBM prematurely, or I shouldn't say prematurely, but for a little bit when it first started as well for his brother of Kurt to drive an Xfinity, when you remember that entire disaster in which Kurt was the bad guy in the media. But when you look at it overall, I mean, Kevin Harvick, let's not forget, he owned a team at one point. Mm-hmm. You have to remember that too, with trucks, Xfinity, or what was then the Busch Series. He's been there, done that. But since Keelan was born, he kind of stepped away and said, okay, that's not for me. And by the way, his team of, or in terms of KHI, still actually exists, but it's actually more of a representation company in terms of management. And he represents boxers and such when it comes to fights, and has a lot of big names in terms of their company for Kevin Harvick Incorporated. But I do agree in that regard. I think you're going to see a lot more NASCAR drivers trying to give back to the sport, which I think is relatively huge. And I'm going to be honest, I know that sports today in terms of NASCAR, really driven on sponsorship. I think things like this, though, take the aspect to sponsorship away, because you look at the drivers that are in this system now. Well, yes, they were in the biggest era of NASCAR, most of them, when sponsorship was huge. Most of them also drove before that came as well. And I think that it starts to look in terms of ownership, okay, I can relate to a driver. It's no longer really those financial decisions. It's more of the product of racing we see on the track, which I think is going to be very interesting moving forward. And I'm really excited to see Bubba alongside Denny and Michael Jordan, which, by the way, a lot of unrealistic expectations, but we'll talk about that later on what Michael Jordan should expect as a team owner in NASCAR. Because if you think that he should expect to win, someone should really go look at the Charlotte Hornets real quick and say that Jordan has expectations of winning. But my SEC, I'll start with my surprise. And I'm going to really go with I'll tell you what, because initially I was going to talk, as I mentioned, about, the lack of penalties and such to open up the year. But I'm going to start with the football end, and I'm going to say this. I'm really, really surprised with how the Ravens in particular have really responded to open up the year. After a tough loss last season in the playoffs, it's like they haven't missed a beat. I thought this was going to be a team that regressed, and Lamar Jackson, off an MVP season, hasn't slowed down. You could say the same thing as well about Patrick Mahomes. Despite a tough win last week as well, he turned around, and he's had a great year to open up. And it's starting to look apparent to me that we're seeing the great football teams earlier, but definitely a surprise that the Baltimore Ravens are still owning that AFC North, in my opinion. Now, my expectations, we mentioned it when we first talked about when baseball was coming back to life, Eddie, the Tampa Bay Rays. In a 60-game season, the expectation was simple. You want a fast-starting team carried by pitching. The Rays are the team. Right now, they sit with the best AL record in the entirety of the American League. And as predicted by me earlier, won the AL East. Now, does it translate to the postseason? I don't know. My expectations moving forward, I still think the Yankees have the best team in the AL. I know they've struggled of late, but they're starting to get back healthy. That 10-game winning streak was a living proof of that. And hey, you face the White Sox, might I remind you, more than likely to open up the playoffs. You could see some teams that you have some really good advantages against, especially in the aspects of pitching, working their way to a World Series. And in conclusion, staying on the baseball end, and you mentioned it earlier, Eddie, it's huge. I'll tell you what, Steve Cohen buying the Mets for the first time since the Mets are really lost in the World Series, a Mets fan can relax and say, we have a future and we may have a good baseball team. Steve Cohen, I'm very bought into it. And I'm not even a Mets fan, but I'm bought into what he feels is going to bring success. And for New York Mets fans, you should be optimistic going into next season, because I have a feeling this offseason in particular, he's going to step in. He's going to make signings, and he's going to do whatever he can to change the atmosphere and culture. And that definitely means taking away Brodie Van Wagenen. But overall, changing the atmosphere, not like the Yankees, because you can't be the New York Yankees, but making it a winning culture that is going to be a competitive team every year in the NL East and competing for a World Series, just like the Dodgers.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm hoping. And a lot of people are talking about with his money that he's going to try to go after Trevor Bauer or JT Realmuto in the offseason. I think Realmuto is a really good move because the Mets have not had a sturdy catcher since Mike Piazza.
I do want to ask one question
Yeah.
before we do, transition topics. What do you think about that Cy Young aspect? I mean, Trevor Bauer, very top option right now in the NL, but he's lost so many games despite a low ERA, and then it's tough for Jacob deGrom as well when you look at it, who you feel like really should be the Cy Young, but he just hasn't had the help around him. What do you see about there? What are you thinking about that?
Okay. Well, they've clearly proven in the last 2 years that win-loss record doesn't really matter, which is why I kind of give the edge to Bauer right now. DeGrom is going to pass him back, though, in strikeouts because DeGrom's got one more start, unless they start Bauer on short rest again on Sunday, which if the Reds are playing for the postseason, they might. But, if it comes down to Sunday. But DeGrom's going to be out there one more time on regular rest. But if DeGrom did not have that bad start 2 weeks ago, where he gave up 3 runs in 2 innings and had the hamstring cramp, he'd be Cy Young all the way. But that bumped his ERA up from 1.7 to 2.0, and in a short season, that's enough. I think it's 4 guys. I think it's between Bauer, DeGrom, Yu Darvish, and Corbin Burns, who's having a great year for Milwaukee. But as much as I want the three-peat, I think it's Trevor Bauer. But hey, going back to our predictions, I know you're pretty good with your predictions, but I'm taking pride in one thing. I said Shane Bieber was going to win the AL Cy Young, and he's up there, and he's probably going to get it. 10 strikeouts in a duel with Lucas Giolito the other night. Still has one more start in the season, probably Sunday, because the Indians, Sox, and Twins are really still fighting for positioning in that American League Central. But regardless, let's move over just to the baseball scene in general. This is the last weekend of this really quick season, and 16 teams are in the playoffs. And when you have that format, like in the NBA and the NHL, there are undeserving teams in the postseason that get dismissed very easily. Now, baseball is always typically different, and, sometimes you'll see the best team get swept or something. Who knows? The Dodgers could lose both their games against whoever they're playing, or the Reds or Milwaukee or whatever. But fact of the matter is, there's only certain teams that I think, even in this system, that can really contend for the World Series. I want you to give me 3 teams that you'd say in each league that you could seriously consider as a team that could make it all the way to the World Series.
When I look on the AL side in particular, again, I already mentioned the Yankees. I think that's an obvious one, despite them being the second in the East. But I look at the Rays. The Rays have the pitching staff as well. The offensive consistency, not quite there. But it is proven as well that pitching wins you championships along with your key role players stepping up. And I really think the Rays have that concept down. Not saying they're going to win a World Series, but they could be a contender in AL. Obviously, the record proves it. But the matter too, Eddie, is the experience. I think that this year in particular, I mean, anyone can win 2 games in a series, which makes it arguably the most stressful playoff I can ever imagine. Obviously, since the addition of the wild card game, fans, have been excited about that game and then a little bit more relaxed about the ALDS and ALCS and so on. For me, it's going to be nerve-wracking watching the Yankees because if you see the stretch they've had, for example, against Toronto the last 2 days, hey, now you're out of the playoffs. So I think the Rays, the Yankees are going to be a team to watch. And I'm going to say the Indians in the AL Central. I really want to see the Twins and the White Sox. But the Twins, I mean, we all know what happens to both them and the Athletics come the postseason. They all the time. So it's just what happens. And, hey, maybe there's time for a change. You never know. And the White Sox, it's going to be their first postseason on the AL side for really in a long time since they've last won a World Series. They have a young team. They're going to have to really, really prove that they can get it done. And, I mean, I don't really have faith in anyone else in AL West. The AL West has been an embarrassment this season. So, hey, I mean, the Athletics have the best chance of all the teams, but I don't even see them going that far. On the NL side, the Dodgers have to be an obvious pick. I think that's pretty clear as day. That team's been dominant out there. And I'm going to say as well, their rivals, the San Diego Padres. I'm digging Slam Diego. This team's come out. They've been explosive offensively. Let's see how that translates to the postseason. And their pitching is young, and it gets better and better every single season. Obviously, they've proven that they're going to be a team of the future. And I think they could find their way in the World Series if they play the cards right. And the third one, it's a really tough decision for me, if I'm being honest. I don't know what to pick between Atlanta and the Cubs. If I'm being honest, the Cubs we know have had a pretty solid year with David Ross. But, Atlanta is pretty well put together team. They know how to get it done. They've had the experience. I'm going to say the Braves. Braves could be competitive this year.
I'm going to disagree on the NL side. I like the Cubs because Atlanta, we know there's a lot of injuries in their pitching staff. Max Fried got scratched from his last start, and he was really their ace throughout the year. And think about how last year's postseason ended. They gave up 10 runs in the first inning of Game 5 of the NLDS. They're probably going to come back hungry after all that, but I don't know how much faith I have in them when the Cubs have a manager who played with those same guys and won a World Series and has transitioned very smoothly to the managerial role. I'm going to go with the Dodgers, Padres, and Cubs as my 3 teams in the National League. In the American League, I actually completely agree with you. Yankees, I have faith in, but the one concern, like you mentioned, how streaky they are. They start the year hot. Then they'd lose all those games. Then they win 10 in a row. Now they can't win again. So there's a lot of give and take with them. The Rays, I do have faith just because of how complete their roster has seen this year. And the Indians, because of out of the 3 AL Central teams, the Twins choke. The White Sox have never been there. White Sox in Toronto, I think 2021, 2022, we can see them really competing in the playoffs. But for now, I don't see it happening. And Oakland, like you said, they always fall apart in the playoffs. I don't know what to expect with them. So, shifting from baseball to basketball, still the bubble going on right now, and the Miami Heat tonight, 1 game away from the NBA Finals. Just a quick prediction here, Tim. Will they wrap it up tonight, or will the Celtics force a Game 6?
Yes, I'll tell you what, when you look at the 2 teams, and I know I wasn't on last week, and I thank Raheel, by the way, for being on as well. But when we talked about this last week, I mean, first off, we were talking about on the opposite side of, will the Nuggets come back in their series? And obviously we know they did on the Western side. On the Eastern side, I said this Miami Heat team looks very, very well. And I wouldn't be surprised if they're going to an NBA championship. Well, yet again, against a Celtics team that has so many top 10 picks in their starting lineups, well, the Miami Heat have a bunch of lower top picks in the first round, and they have looked very, very well. This is a team that is playing better basketball as a system compared to the Celtics, who have the better talent, quote unquote, but just haven't been able to put it all together. I think the Heat continue that great play. I mean, compared to the two teams, Eddie, that we saw really good in the bubble to open up, obviously, I shouldn't say two, there was really three or four. The Suns, obviously, who didn't make it. Toronto, who we thought was going to be good, didn't turn out that way. But Miami, and as well as Portland, who is also gone. But Miami's been that one team that stayed consistent and hasn't slowed down since their hot start in the bubble. I think they win it tonight. I think they go to the NBA Finals. And I don't want to jump to my prediction on the Western side, but I think they play the Lakers.
Yeah, I mean, let's just get that over with. So, do you think the Lakers are gonna finish it off in a game 5, or do you think Denver's gonna come back?
I would love to see for the third consecutive time a 3-1 miracle, just like how so many times many years back when you remember the Rangers made the Stanley Cup Finals, where they came back so many times from down 3-0 in a series. But the realism is you can only put yourself down so many times before you can't come back. And when you're facing arguably the best team left in the NBA right now, talent-wise, you're going to have to deal with that deficit. And unfortunately, the Lakers have outplayed them basketball-wise. I mean, let's put it like this. When you struggle to even compete in a game where Anthony Davis doesn't get a single rebound until the final 5 minutes in the fourth quarter, you have an issue. And they just barely won that game. So the fact that you shut down AD rebound-wise, and you just barely beat the Lakers doesn't convince me the fact that you have everything shut down. And that doesn't, take away from the fact that Murray has had a great NBA playoffs, and their team as a defensive whole has played incredibly, incredibly well. But the Lakers are premier talent. They invested in the players because they had one goal, winning the championship and finally bringing back a title to LA, as well as this year, as we know, doing it for Kobe. I think the Lakers dominate today. It's going to be a blowout game, in my opinion, and you'll see the Lakers in the NBA Finals yet again since, when Kobe last won a championship.
I'm going to disagree. I think the Nuggets are going to stave off one game. I think they're going to force a game 6, and the Lakers will take care of them there. I think we get one more really good performance in the bubble from Jamal Murray. I think it'll be a close game, but I think the Nuggets might close it out by 5 or 6. But then game 6, I think the Lakers will. LeBron will, he'll be frustrated. He'll give a nice team speech, and they'll come out motivated and win by a big margin. For the Heat, I agree. I think they're going to finish it off. I mean, they're getting such – and credit to Pat Riley, too. Some of these draft picks, like Tyler Hero, who had fallen in the draft because of injury in college, he scores 37 points in a playoff game. He's younger than you, Tim. And Bam Adebayo, I mean, he kind of fell because there was concerns about how he'd match up with other big men, because though he's tall, he's not really, he's not as muscular as some of the other big men, and he's done so well. Of course, that big block in game 1. And just some of their just acquisitions too. You've got the one quote unquote star in Jimmy Butler. You've got Crowder, and you've got Goran Dragic with a lot of playoff experience, and Iguodala. You throw them all in. Kendrick Nunn, who was undrafted, you throw him into this roster. I mean, you've got quite the mix of players. They've all meshed well. Erik Spoelstra has so much experience in this position, going to the finals 7-8 years ago with Miami with LeBron and D Wade. So, I think the Heat finished it off, and I think we can agree Heat Lakers in the finals, and that's going to be fun to watch. I know there's the two superstars on one side and the Heat, the definite underdogs, but I think it'll be fun. Let's move on now. Last topic before our picks, NASCAR. We were talking about silly season last time you were here, and, just figuring things out, and there's been two big surprises. First, Ross Chastain is actually going to Ganassi to drive the 42 Cup car. I wanted to, before we get to Bubba and all that, my problem here is that Ganassi is a team that needs sponsorship. And with, no more Kyle Larson, we know how much they've struggled for sponsorship. Kurt Busch is their other driver. I don't see Kurt Busch going anywhere at this point, and think about it. He doesn't have much sponsorship. He drives the Monster Energy car every week. That's basically what he's got. And, I mean, the 42, ever since everything with DC Solar, there's been a lot of uncertainty. Target, of course, is not one of their sponsors anymore, and that was their major sponsor for 2 decades. And, the Chastain brings the Florida Watermelon Coalition. He does not bring much to the table in terms of sponsorship. And I just feel like he's the type of guy who would benefit from one more year in Xfinity. I don't know. I know it's not like they were going to keep Kenseth there in the Cup car for another year, but I just I know people will get mad if I say this, but he has not won yet in Xfinity this year. He's been consistent, but he still has not gotten the victory lane. He's been a bit of a letdown from what we had hoped and expected after what he did in an underfunded truck last year in the Truck Series. But I just feel like this might be a little bit of a rush job, and I feel like there might not be looking big picture. When you think about someone bringing in somebody like an Eric Jones who has Cup experience and also has sponsorship ties, but they have gone with Chastain. Before we get to everything with Bubba, Tim, your reaction on the Ross Chastain signing?
Yeah, it was a little bit surprising to me because of the fact that they brought in Matt Kenseth in response to the whole Kyle Larson thing, earlier in the year. And to me, again, I've made it very vocal. I'm not a big buyer in Ross Chastain himself. I really feel that he's a very overrated driver just because of what he did in underfunded equipment in the lowest of quoted tiers in NASCAR of its big three tier lists. And listen, I mean, don't get me wrong, he won a truck race, but you're competing in a truck series against 9 or 10 competitive trucks. When you move to Xfinity, it's about 18 or 19 cars. You've got to step up with the big boys now, and you're going to have 30 cars in a given week that are relatively funded and can compete in the top 10 every single week. This year in particular has been unpredictable. I mean, who would have expected, for example, Austin Dillon to have an incredible bounce back year? Who would expect Tyler Reddick with RCR to have a solid year? Even Bubba Wallace in that 43 has had a good year. And how about Front Row? They've competed for top 10s, especially with Michael McDowell this year. But the big thing is, again, this is still a sponsorship-driven sport. Unless he's getting every watermelon company in the world on his car, I don't see him as a big sponsorship bringer. And that's my big thing as an Alex Bowman fan, for example, that Alex Bowman really struggles with. He doesn't bring in big sponsors. Yes, he had his backing from Dale Jr. in particular, but he's not that big sponsor guy, which now what? Makes his future a little bit more questionable with Hendrick. While, yes, he does have a ride for next year, no one knows what car number he's going to be. No one knows what his sponsor is going to be because they haven't locked down a sponsor. I feel like that could be an issue with the 42 moving forward with Ross Chastain. But I do want to make a point about this. You mentioned about it feel like a rush job and being too soon. I do want to recall an instance that happened in the 42 prior to that. Let's not forget what happened to Kyle Larson. Larson didn't win an Xfinity race. Yes, he was somewhat competitive in the 37, but everyone felt he got called up to the Cup Series way too soon. And ultimately, look at the big picture, despite what happened this year, look how that turned out. Larson's considered one of the superstars in the sport. And while, yes, he doesn't drive right now, every year he's become a title contender favorite, even though he hasn't been able to do it consistently. And sure, just like Chastain, you could say there may be a little bit of an overhype, but there's no denying the talent and how much he can wheel a race car, especially to victory lane. And again, there was a lot of criticism on that move. Maybe Ganassi feels it'll work out the same exact way as Larson. Obviously, you can't compare the two, but in terms of the success rate, it may end up working out in the long run, which is the only reason why I can think about them doing this move this soon.
So let's shift gears to the, elephant in the room. Bubba Wallace leaving Richard Petty Motorsports and driving for Denny Hamlin and Michael Jordan in a Toyota team that takes Germain Racing's charter, essentially replaces the role that Levine Family Racing had. And you can react in a minute, but let me just start with what I gotta say here. There are people on social media, and I know NASCAR Twitter is not the best place to go for, sane opinions sometimes. You've got, of course, the people who are all freaked out that Bubba Wallace got a big ride, the racists out there. But then you've got the people who are going too far the other way, who are just like, he's one of the most talented drivers. That's why Michael Jordan picked Bubba Wallace because he's Bubba Wallace. Bubba Wallace has drawn so much attention to NASCAR this year. Bubba Wallace has drawn NASCAR a lot of new fans this year after everything that he went through with the whole garage door pole noose incident. Like, there's reasons that Michael Jordan picked Bubba Wallace. I mean, he's African American. We need to just establish that first of all. Now, of course, the other way, people are saying he's going to finish last place every week and all that. No, he's not. I know what you said earlier. I mean, this team's not going to be. They're not going to be Rick Ware Racing. They're going to have some backing. We've seen how many sponsors Bubba Wallace has been able to bring in just in the last couple of months between Columbia, DoorDash, McDonald's. I mean, big-time sponsors, big companies, not these random motor oil companies that you've never heard of, real tangible sponsors that are well-known nationwide that Bubba Wallace has been able to bring in. I think that this team has the potential to be successful down the road. I think year one's going to be a little bit of a struggle. I think this is a team that when they go to the next gen car in 2022, once they've kind of established things, once Michael Jordan and Denny Hamlin have kind of gotten on the same page, figured out how to do this car owning thing, I think that's when they can start to succeed. But people who are expecting them to win races in the first year, you have to calm down for a moment.
Yeah, I think the expectations are a little bit over people's head because let's put it like this, okay? Tony Stewart in particular is a very huge anomaly to NASCAR drivers owning another car inside the Cup Series. Now think about this. Tony turned around that 14 along with Ryan Newman, the 39, and made it successful in a two-car stable for about, maybe 2-3 years before they expanded finally to 4.
Mm-hmm.
You have to remember DEI. When Dale Earnhardt started his own stable with Michael Waltrip, Dale Jr., Steve Park, prior to those 3 getting there, you had guys like Darrell Waltrip driving the 1 car. And we have to remember, they didn't succeed right away. There's a lot of learning they have to do. Drivers that tend to be team owners in today's NASCAR don't really tend to own Cup Series teams to start. They go to the lower tiers first to understand whatever. Not saying that they don't know how to put together a car, but it's the aspect of building the funding, building from the ground up. This is building a structure before it has its grounding, essentially. And the people that say Bubba is going to finish last place, he's not going to finish last place, but don't expect him to win every week. You have to understand, Bubba Wallace is a very good driver. I'm not denying that. Well, he didn't win in Xfinity with Jack Roush. He did win in solid equipment with KBM in the Truck Series. Now, the Truck Series, like I said, is far different from Xfinity and Cup. But Bubba has shined to an extent, just like Matt DiBenedetto did last year in the 95, that he can drive in somewhat solid equipment. Not good equipment, because, again, I consider RPM to be, D-level equipment. But good enough that he could be a top 15, top 10 driver. He comes to this solo team, which we already know Gibbs' history, might I remind you, about teams shutting down. I think this is a huge opportunity for him. I honestly, and I'm just going to say it now, he's going to win the pole for the Daytona 500. That is my prediction now. We're not even near February, but that is my prediction because, let's be honest, the biggest storyline tends to win poles in Daytona.
Yep.
I'm not saying it's rigged, but that's just what tends to happen. You win the Daytona 500 pole, and how he does it Daytona and the week after will dictate how the rest of his season goes. If he's a competitor early on at a track that isn't a super speedway, it's going to be a solid year for Bubba. He may compete for a chase spot. You never know. But I'm not jumping the gun and saying that he's going to compete for a championship with the likes of Kyle Busch, Kevin Harvick, and everyone else every single week. He's going to have to do some earning and learning in solid equipment first before he can get to that level. Because just because you have the best equipment doesn't mean you're going to succeed right away. And I think the best of the best drivers have proven that already in their careers.
Yeah, so it's going to be interesting, but still nonetheless, this is a big opportunity for NASCAR, having someone with the attention that Michael Jordan brings to the sport, now owning a team, and hopefully this sets the precedent that maybe more people from outside of the typical NASCAR scene start to get ownership positions in the sport and, kind of cement more of a nationwide fan base. So,
and I do just want to add one more thing as well. Smart move by Bubba, by the way, because remember the last time we talked about this in regards to, well, if he moves to like a Hendrick, for example, well, then he loses his partnership with Coca-Cola because that's a Pepsi-based team. Well, guess what? This move doesn't take him away from the Coca-Cola Racing family. In fact, it keeps him because Denny Hamlin himself is a part of the Coca-Cola Racing family, which makes the sponsorship opportunities even bigger. And again, there's a lot of upside from this, not just from the aspect of, again, Michael Jordan getting involved in NASCAR and getting more, maybe African Americans in particular having interest in the sport as well. But there's an upside in regards to a lot of sponsorship is going to be thrown out into this team and a lot of money is going to be coming in, which means that we're going to see a very funded race car, to say the least. And we could see this team expand in the future, which you can really hope, compared to teams like, for example, Furniture Row or, most recently Levine Family that have shut down because they didn't have those big backings.
So it's going to be fun to see. Let's wrap things up here with our week 3 pick'em. And so far we've gotten lucky, but combined we're 11-1. And the only loss is because the Eagles blew a 17-point lead week 1, which if you watch the show with Raheel, I went on quite the rant about the Eagles, who are 0-2 right now. Still repping my Eagles shirt, though. I have faith that Carson Wentz can turn things around, even though he's been awful to start the year. So I'm going to start with my 3 picks for the week. Once again, I'm 5-1 so far. Thank you to the Cowboys for coming back from down 20, and thank you to the Falcons for choking so I could get the perfect record last week. I actually completely looked over and skipped Arizona and Detroit. I should have picked that because I think that Cardinals should be highly favored. But anyway, I'm going to roll with what I've got. First one, the Bills. Josh Allen has been probably the best quarterback in the first 2 weeks other than Mahomes and Lamar Jackson, right there with Russell Wilson. He has been so consistent on the ground, through the air, with Stephon Diggs. That offense has been dynamic. And though the Rams have looked good so far too, the NFC West teams combined are 7-1 to start the year. I've got Buffalo taking this one at home. Tampa Bay, I think pretty easily will get by Denver. Denver is going to have Jeff Driscoll as their quarterback. Tom Brady settled down last week against Carolina to get them the win. I think the Bucs are going to 2-1. And then maybe my bold prediction, America's Game of the Week, Sunday at 4, Seattle and Dallas. The Seahawks are home despite no 12th man. I think they're going to get it done and get to 3-0. I think that's going to be a close game. I think it's going to be really good offense on both sides, but I got the Seahawks coming out on top of that one.
Yeah, had you not picked the Seattle over Dallas game, I was actually going to make the same prediction. But I was kind of tied this week because I'm going to be honest, I was really tempted to make a decision on the Monday and Sunday night football games, but I just couldn't. I'm going to be honest. This is going to be the most exciting 2 games in terms of prime time that I feel we've seen really not just this season, but in a little while. I mean, we're going to see some really good football games, especially out of the Green Bay Packers, who have looked lights out with Aaron Rodgers to open up the year. But I was also tied upon another team. Obviously, we know my New York Giants 0-2, terrible start. But there's an upside. By the way, this is not my prediction, but they have a matchup that plays into their favors in regards to the fact that they're going to face Nick Mullins on Sunday. And obviously, yes, while they face a beaten and battered 49ers team that still has a bunch of talent, Daniel Jones has a lot to prove, and the last time the Giants faced a backup quarterback of C.J. Beathard about 4 seasons ago in the era of Ben McAdoo, almost said the butchered name because I just don't like the guy that simple, but the Giants ended up winning that year, and that is a terrible, terrible season. Could they carry? I don't know. But now to my picks. I'm going to go Indianapolis over the Jets. I want Adam Gase fired. It's just that simple. Indianapolis has looked surprising this year. I know week 1 they blew the lead, but last season they turned around and were effective. Phillip Rivers has looked very solid, surprisingly, to open up the year. It's like a brand new Phillip. Obviously has a very good offensive line, might I mind you, which helps. And that defense hasn't really slowed down being competitive. The Jets, they're still beaten and battered. Sam Darnold is still seeing ghosts, whether you believe it or not. And overall, I think Indianapolis is going to blow out the Jets. I have Arizona over Detroit. You mentioned them a brief while ago. I don't think there's really much to talk about that. Matt Patricia is the worst play caller in history, despite him saying he's the best. And Arizona, they're not going to slow down. This is going to be a team with DeAndre Hopkins that is going to swallow secondaries all year long. We're starting to see, I guess, I don't want to say the second coming of Lamar Jackson because both of these guys came together, but we're starting to see two mobile quarterbacks. They're able to throw and be scary threats on a regular basis. Hey, Kyler Murray, they turn around and have an MVP year this year, which you never know, but he's looked very well to open up the year as well. And my final pick, this one again, I think another one-sided pick. The Los Angeles Chargers beating the Carolina Panthers. The Panthers losing Christian McCaffrey. And let's be honest, Teddy Bridgewater in a mediocre unit never has really turned out well. I personally never view Teddy Bridgewater as a good quarterback. I think he was an average quarterback with a solid team around him that really pushed him. We're seeing with Carolina that he's not a superstar that he was believed to be. They've had a tough year to open up. No McCaffrey makes things even tougher. That offense is in absolute shambles, to say the least. Now, obviously, that defense has been crying with no Luke Kuechly since he's retired. I think that it's going to be a blowout for the Chargers, who, by the way, probably will have Joey Bosa going all over the place because that is one scary defense, to say the least.
Yeah, so we're going to have to see what happens. Big weekend in sports, and we'll be back next Friday to recap all of that. Until then, I'm Eddie Kalegi.
And I'm Tim Moore.
Wishing to see you next time here on Sports Speak.